we're going to start recording and we're going to go back and look at plants some more. And the other day we talked about non-vascular plants, and today we're going to focus on vascular plants. And one way to think about the plants is that there's three big groups of plants, and then there's three subgroups within each of those. We talked about the non-vascular plants, and with the non-vascular plants, we had the mosses, and we had the hornworts, and we have the liverworts. And we also have a group that are vascular plants that don't make seeds. So they're called the seedless vascular plants. And there are three groups of those. There are lycopods, and there are horsetails, and there are ferns. And then we have vascular plants that make seeds. And there are three groups of those. There are some plants called gymnosperms or conifers. We usually call them evergreens, but that's probably not the best way to think of them. And then there are two groups of flowering plants, one called monocots and one called dicots. So today we're going to talk about vascular plants. Before we go on, though, I did want to point out that later today I'll post some questions on animals, and they'll be due a week from today. This is a pretty large assignment, so don't wait to get started on them. One section of the assignment is kind of similar to the insect order assignment that we did recently. The other thing to keep in mind, and I'll send an email and remind you, but there is no class tomorrow or Friday. Even though our midterm break was a little while ago, we have Good Friday and Holy Thursday off. They just give them some different names to be politically correct, but that's really what it is, Good Friday and Holy Thursday. So no class tomorrow or Friday. So let's think about vascular plants, and remember what we said the other day. Vascular plants have two main tissues in them. They have some different cells that make up the xylem. We'll look at some of these different cells in more detail later. But xylem basically carries material upward from the roots. So this is water that the roots absorb. Remember, water was one of the reactants of photosynthesis. If you don't remember photosynthesis, it's probably good to go back and review the difference between the light-dependent and the light-independent reactions. And then we have phloem. And phloem transports materials in all different directions, up, down, can transport materials more than once. You know, if you think about it, xylem pretty much transports things one time when the water and whatever is dissolved in it gets absorbed by the roots, and that's it. Phloem can transport the same chemical compound numerous times. So when we think of vascular plants, if we slice through the stem or a leaf, this is what we're going to see inside there, xylem and phloem. The xylem and phloem aren't always arranged in this kind of face-like pattern, but we do always see xylem and phloem. So we want to keep that in mind. So let's look at the basic life cycle of a vascular plant that is a seedless vascular plant. So it doesn't produce any seeds. The example that they give looks like it's a fern to me. The sporophyte is down here. And if we look at the vascular plants, one way that they're different from the non-vascular plants is that they have vascular tissue. Another way they're different is when we look at the non-vascular plants, the gametophyte is usually the dominant phase of the life cycle. And remember what we said, by dominant, we just mean if you look at a moss or a liverwort or a hornwort, you're probably looking at the gametophyte, and the gametophyte is larger, it's more prominent. When we look at the vascular plants, the sporophyte is the dominant stage of the life cycle. The gametophyte tends to be small, and sometimes it even stays attached to the sporophyte. So if we look at spores, on the underside of the leaf, which we call a frond on a fern, is a sporangium. And the sporangium makes spores. it releases those spores. The spores are single-celled. The spores, notice we have a color key up here. The sporangium is diploid. The spores are haploid. So these spores are made by meiosis. So we have a single-celled cell that we have a single-celled spore that's 1N, that's haploid. And when we look, this cell starts to divide by mitosis. And as it divides by mitosis, it forms the gametophyte. Now, the gametophyte produces two types of reproductive organs. It produces an antheridium that makes sperm, and it produces archegonium that make eggs. Notice antheridia ending in A is just plural, or archegonia ending in A is just plural. The sperm fertilizes the egg, we get a zygote, the zygote starts to divide by mitosis, and we get a new sporophyte. So notice that when we look at this, we don't see anything anywhere on this diagram that says seed, or we don't see anything on here that says ovary. Remember, we talked very briefly the other day that the ovary develops into the fruit, which is what encases the seed in angiosperms. So let's look at the three groups of non-vascular plants very briefly. One group is called lycophytes or lycopods. Phyte just means plant. Remember when we talked about protists, we had chlorophytes and charophytes. They were photosynthetic, they weren't plants. These organisms, these plants, are also called club mosses. So what we see down here is most of the, what we sometimes call the vegetative part of the plant. The green is the part that's actively carrying out photosynthesis. These light tan structures, these are the reproductive structures or the clubs. So when we look at these, this plant, again, is typically restricted to a relatively moist environment, because when it releases the spores here, the spores have to swim to a new location. Well, they don't really swim much. They mostly just drift on the water. Now, one of the things that makes lycopods distinctive is if we look at the stem or the trunk, however you'd like to describe it. And unless you have this downloaded on your computer, it may be hard to see on mine. But I'll try to magnify it a little bit more even. One of the things we can see is if we look at this greenery tends to branch in kind of a Y pattern. There are almost always two branches that split off from one another. So if you can't see this on mine, try to look at this a little bit later, download it, or open the file on your computer so that you can change the magnification. When we look at the lycopods or lycophytes, these are the first plants in the fossil record that have true roots and leaves. And really the leaves are similar to the needles that we see on some pine trees. And they grow out of the stem. And the leaves are called microphyls. Now we said phyte means plant, phyl means leaf. Think of chlorophyll, that's green leaf, literally. And these contain one vascular bundle. The leaves are very small. Now, keep in mind later when we look at larger plants, think of grass that might be growing in your front yard, or a leaf on an oak tree or a maple tree. Those have numerous vascular bundles in them. So here, there's just one of these little clumps of xylem and phloem, just a single one. When we look at the sporophylls, which are the clubs that stick up, those brown structures, so notice most of the green is actually part of the gametophyte. When we look at these, they're specialized for reproduction. That's why they're not green. They're not worker bees. They don't bother to carry out photosynthesis. The photosynthetic parts of the plant feed them glucose. Now, the extant species, and remember what we said, extant is the opposite of extinct, means they haven't gone extinct. Extant species are small, but if we go back in geological history to the time of the dinosaurs, there were lycophytes that formed trees. So they were much, much larger. And in fact, there's pretty good evidence that lycophytes, along with horsetails, actually form a lot of the fossil fuel that we call coal, because sometimes coal is not completely formed. And when it's not completely formed, you can actually see the leaves and the stems that are being crushed to make the organic material into coal. So now we said there were three main groups. So the lycopods or lycophytes are one group. The other two are the ferns and the horsetails. Now they used to be separate groups, but now they're both clumped together as pterophytes. Remember when we talked about classification, one of the things we said is biologists tend to fall into two categories, lumpers and splitters. So right now, at least in botany, the lumpers seem to be in control, and they've decided that horsetails and ferns are so closely related, they should be placed in the same group. So they're called pterophytes. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, if you're not really using our book and you're using a different source to get information from, if you go back and you see anything that's more than maybe 10 or 15 years old, pterophytes used to refer to just the ferns by themselves. So if you're reading about pterophytes and it doesn't seem to be saying anything about horsetails, it probably just means that it's an older piece of material when the pterophytes only included the ferns. Now, of all the groups that are alive today, the species of ferns have the best developed vascular tissue. We do see ferns in forests in Illinois. You might think of them as being tropical plants, but there are some found in the forests of Illinois. But the ones in the forests of Illinois are relatively small. They might get a foot or two tall, so not quite a meter. There are some tropical species that get up to about 25 meters in height, so about 70 feet, 75 feet. So much, much larger. And again, if we go back to the time of the dinosaurs, ferns were much more common plants in the forests than they are today, for some reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later. The group that's currently classified with ferns, but used to be in a completely separate group, is horsetails. And keep in mind, as I've said the other day, especially when we look at the names of plants, when you look at their common names, you have to use your imagination a little bit. I guess this little brown bulb on the end kind of looks like the tail of a horse. I don't know if you squint real hard and use your imagination. But because of this little brown bulb, and if you look on the stems, you might be able to see there are some little horizontal brown lines every once in a while. These plants are typically relatively easy to identify, at least as far as being horsetails. It can be harder to figure out exactly which genus they are and which species they are, but just knowing it's a horsetail, pretty straightforward. Now, these three groups, the non-vascular, the vascular seedless plants, were all more prominent in the past. And part of the reason that they were more prominent in the past is because if we look at the vascular plants that make seeds, the vascular plants that make seeds have a more efficient reproductive system. They can basically out-reproduce the seedless vascular plants. And some of the plants that make seeds have evolved more recently. Remember, we said the first plants that moved onto land were non-vascular plants. And after them, the seedless plants became dominant, but now plants that make seeds are dominant. You know, if you think about plants that we haven't mentioned so far, we haven't mentioned grass that might be growing in your front yard. We haven't mentioned any type of plants that you might have in your garden, whether it's a flower or whether it's a plant that you have planted to get vegetables from, beans, corn, rice, something like that. So we need to think about what's a seed. Most of the seedless plants only make one type of spore when they reproduce. When we look at seed plants, they make two types of spores. One of the spores is bigger, and this is called the female, and since it's bigger, it's a megaspore. Remember, we've said on several occasions, it's an advantage for female reproductive organs to be larger. They can produce larger, healthier seeds. And the female megaspore develops into the female gametophyte. And this is actually inside the parent sporophyte. So plants that make seeds, when you look at an oak tree or a tomato plant or a blade of grass in your front yard, you're looking at the sporophyte. If they make a gametophyte, which they might not do very often, depending on the plant, but if they make one, it's actually attached to the sporophyte and it's much smaller. So if we go back to our club moss for a moment, we don't see a situation like this where you can see the sporophyte, these kind of brown and whitish structures growing out of the green, where the green is the gametophyte, the white and tan are the sporophytes. If you look at a blade of grass, or if you look at a oak tree, or if you look at a tomato plant, you're only seeing the sporophyte. The gametophyte is actually inside. Now, the female gametophyte is going to produce eggs. The smaller spore is called a microspore, and this is going to make the male gametophyte, and the male gametophyte is going to form pollen grains, which in the case of seed plants are their equivalent of sperm. And then the pollen, think sperm, is going to fertilize the egg. Now notice when we look at the seed plants, they do have a problem. I mean, it's an advantage in a way. Seed plants aren't restricted to moist environments. Think about a tree growing in your yard. Think about a tomato plant in your garden. Think about a grass plant in your front yard. That's not necessarily a very moist environment. Depending how dry it is, you might have to water your lawn in the middle of summer. So this means that the sperm can't swim to the egg. So one of the things that is both an advantage and a disadvantage is for seed plants, they have to find some way to get the sperm to the egg. That's the downside. The upside is, since the sperm don't swim to the egg, you don't have to live in a moist environment. You can live almost anywhere. You have to have enough water to survive, so the middle of the Sahara Desert won't work, but most other environments will work. Once the pollen fertilizes the egg, we have an embryo. Around the embryo, we have a supply of nutrients. Remember, this is a plant, so when the seed germinates and starts to grow, it's probably not going to be able to photosynthesize immediately. So these nutrients are so that that little baby plant has something to grow and to use for aerobic cell respiration until it can start photosynthesizing on its own. And around this is a seed covering called the ovule. And basically, when we get to the edge of the ovule, that's the end of the seed. So when you look at an ovule and everything inside it, that's a seed. Now, in many groups, there's some more tissue outside that ovule, and we'll talk about that later. So there's two main groups of seed plants. One is the conifers or gymnosperms. And conifers, think of that name, they're cone-bearing plants. Now keep in mind, cones are not necessarily what you might think of. We said the other day, gymnosperms, gymno means the seed is naked. And it's naked because there's no tissue outside the ovule. Now, you may not have realized it, but the reproductive organs on the conifers or gymnosperms is the cones. They do not make flowers. Sometimes we mistakenly think of all plants as producing flowers. So keep in mind, no flowers here. So let's look at the difference between a seed that a gymnosperm makes and a seed that an angiosperm, a flowering plant, makes. So let's start in the middle and work our way out, because in the middle things are similar. So in the middle, we have our megasporocyte. This is what's going to form the egg. Around this, we have some structure called the nucellus. And the nucellus is derived from the ovule of the plant. And then around this, we have a layer of integument. And this is kind of the edge of the ovule. Notice we may have multiple layers of integument in an angiosperm. At some point, there's an opening called a micropyle in this integument. This micropyle is where the pollen enters the nucellus and eventually fertilizes the megasporocyte or egg cell. Notice that since the pollen doesn't get deposited right next to the egg cell, the pollen actually has to dig something called a pollen tube. And in some flowers, this pollen tube may be several inches from where the pollen is deposited and where the egg is fertilized. Now, all this kind of pinkish around the integument that we see in the angiosperm, notice that none of that is present in the gymnosperm. This is why the gymnosperm is a naked seed. This blue oval represents the outer edge of the ovule, and there's nothing beyond that. That's why this is naked. In the angiosperm, this lighter pink represents tissue that's derived from the ovary of the plant. And the darker pink is the actual wall of the ovary. And so this ovary forms the material that we would call a fruit. Technically, when we look at a seed that comes from a flowering plant, the seed is only this inner part, and the outer part is the ovary. So if you think of most of what you eat, if you've ever sliced open a cucumber or a watermelon or a tomato, you can see the seeds. Most of the rest of that is tissue from the ovary. There are some other tissues that can be found there as well, but the ovary essentially surrounds the seeds. So when we look at gymnosperms, what type of plants are we talking about? Well, a lot of people just refer to gymnosperms as pine trees. Technically, pines are one particular group of gymnosperm. But there are other gymnosperms called spruces, firs, one called hemlocks, one called yews, larches, cedars, and some of the oldest and largest trees in the world, redwoods and sequoias. You know, you've probably seen some pictures, but if you haven't, you know, you should Google redwoods. There are redwoods out on the west coast of the United States that are so large. There are 2-lane roads running through the middle of the trunk. I'm not sure if you could get anything more than 2 loads. If we look at gymnosperms, they're often called evergreens. And from a technical point of view, evergreens refers to plants that don't lose their leaves. This isn't completely accurate because actually some of the conifers, some of the gymnosperms do lose their leaves. We'll talk more about leaf loss later, but notice that, you know, living in the part of the country where we are in Chicago, we sometimes have a mistaken notion. We think that plants lose their leaves because the weather is cold. Plants actually lose their leaves in most cases because they don't have access to water. It's true the weather is cold in a Chicago winter, but for plants, a bigger problem is all the water is frozen. It's either ice or snow. Plant roots can't absorb frozen water. So since the plant root can't absorb frozen water, the plant doesn't have access to water in the winter. But there are parts of the world where trees lose their leaves during a dry season, and it's actually warm during the dry season. So we know that temperature is not typically the main issue. So conifers do reproduce with cones. Notice that there are male and female cones. When you think of a pine cone, you think of male cones, or female cones, much larger, much more prominent. Male cones are smaller. Why are they smaller? Well, a small male cone can still make plenty of sperm because sperm are smaller than eggs. Now, even though many of the gymnosperms do lose leaves during either some sort of dry season, some gymnosperms do keep their leaves all winter. In this part of the country, you know, pines, firs, spruces, these are some of the main gymnosperms that we find. They do keep their leaves in the winter. But they still have the same problem that the flowering plants do. There's not much water available in winter. Now, you know, here in Chicago, our winters are variable. The last few years have been a little bit warmer than normal, thanks to global warming, but even without global warming, there are sometimes warm spells in winter where snow and ice melt, and plants can temporarily absorb some water. But for a lot of the winter, water isn't available. So gymnosperms have to have a way to conserve water. Now, most of the water that a plant loses, it loses from its leaves. Why? Because the leaves is where photosynthesis occurs. And remember, one of the reactants of photosynthesis is carbon dioxide. The other reactant is water. Well, here's the problem that plants have. There are little holes in the leaves called stomata. And the stomata let air into the leaf. Why does the leaf need air? For the carbon dioxide, so it can carry out photosynthesis. The problem with letting air in is then water can evaporate out of those stomata. So if you open the stomata to let in carbon dioxide, unfortunately, there's a trade-off. You also lose some water by evaporation. And if you think about it, even when the weather is cold, there is evaporation. If you've ever been outside and shoveled snow for a few minutes when it's, you know, 10 degrees out or minus 10, you know that you can come indoors and you're soaking wet. Why? Because you do sweat, even in cold weather. Now, how do conifers, how do gymnosperms minimize the amount of water that they lose? Well, their leaves are covered with a very thick, waxy layer called a cuticle. And remember that wax is a lipid, and we know that lipids don't mix well with water. So one of the things that we often see in nature is when living organisms have to waterproof something, they use wax. So this prevents some of the water loss. Also think about the leaves on a conifer. The leaves are the needles. Well, notice that the needles don't have very much surface area, something that we talked about a few weeks ago. Well, the bigger a surface area you have, the more sunlight you can collect, which is good for photosynthesis. But the bigger a surface area you have, the more sunlight strikes you. So also you lose more water by evaporation. So having a very small leaf tends to minimize the amount of water that you lose also. And there's also another crucial factor. So here's some leaves. Notice that some conifers have leaves that are more like scales than needles. If you have a cedar bush, or if you've seen a cedar bush in somebody's yard, these are cedar leaves. Gymnosperms have another crucial thing that helps them conserve water. The stomata are actually in pits that are sunk into the surface of the leaf. So what does this mean? If you think about a little indentation in the leaf, those pits aren't exposed to the sunlight directly. So that helps minimize water loss. And also those pits aren't exposed directly to water blowing over the plant. When water blows over something, it causes water to evaporate. When the wind blows over something, sorry. So this is another way that they can conserve water. So gymnosperms conserve water. This allows them to retain their leaves in winter, at least in some climates. But there's a downside to this. Gymnosperms tend to grow more slowly. Remember what we said, they've got small leaves, so they don't get exposed to as much sunlight, which means they don't carry out as much photosynthesis. So the good news is you don't lose as much water. The bad news is you can't photosynthesize as quickly. So because of this, if we look at a forest and we look at gymnosperms grow best in an open area where they have access to sunlight. Because if you have a gymnosperm growing next to an angiosperm, angiosperms can grow faster. And in the plant world, if you grow slow, you get shaded out. You don't get sunlight. So when we look at gymnosperms, usually if there's a bunch of angiosperms, oak trees, maple trees, beech trees around them, the gymnosperms are kind of in a clearing where a tree fell down. Or they're in a forest that's all conifers. But typically we don't see them as much, just scattered here and there among angiosperm trees. Now, one of the things that conifers have is they have something that's called secondary growth. And notice many of these topics, if they don't make a lot of sense now, don't panic. We're going to talk about plant tissues, all the different types of cells in plants, and we'll talk about primary growth and secondary growth. But from a basic standpoint, secondary growth is simply wood. So some plants don't make secondary growth. Grass growing in your front yard is not going to produce wood, no matter how long it grows. Only certain groups of plants make secondary growth. So what is secondary growth? Well, if we cut open a tree trunk, this is a tree trunk from a white pine, it looks like, we can see a couple of things. We can see the bark. Notice that the outer layer of the bark is a different material than the inner layer of the bark. The inner layer would be the dark brown right next to this lighter area. The inner layer of the bark is actually some of that phloem that we talked about earlier. This is why one way to kill a tree is to make a strip all the way around a tree and take all the bark off. Because if you do that, now the tree can't transport nutrients up and down past that spot. All the area in here, all this lighter area until we get into the very middle, all this lighter area is xylem. Xylem is what makes up what we commonly call wood. So phloem is part of the bark, xylem is part of the wood. Now the layer of cells that actually divides and makes more xylem and more phloem is right on the inside of the bark. So this means this layer of cells divides, and it divides by mitosis. When it divides by mitosis, it pushes one cell into the xylem or the phloem, and one cell stays and continues dividing. So this means if you think about the layer of cells that's dividing, it's something called the vascular cambium. Remember, xylem and phloem are vascular tissue. Cambiums are tissues in a plant that continue dividing throughout life. When the vascular cambium makes more xylem, notice that the newest xylem is towards the outside of the tree. The very oldest xylem is towards the inside. So we can actually divide the xylem up into two categories. The very outer layers of the xylem, exactly how many layers depends on the climate and the type of tree and a couple of other factors. But the outer layers are called the sapwood. Now, sap really is a non-scientific term, but sap refers to the liquid that flows in the xylem and phloem. So the sapwood has active role in plant metabolism. Materials still travel through this. However, as the plant gets older, the very inner layers of xylem start to form what's sometimes called heartwood. And basically the xylem tubes, which are kind of hollow cells, they lose all their cytoplasm, they lose their nucleus. Those xylem tubes get clogged up, so they don't conduct fluid anymore. So when we look at a tree that's more than a few years old, it does have some heartwood and some sapwood. The heartwood is always more towards the middle. The sapwood is more towards the outside. In the very inside of a tree, we have an area called the pith. And if we look at the pith, even if the tree is really large, the pith is typically maybe the size of a silver dollar. So it's not very big, and it can be smaller than that. It can be more like the size of a dime. So these are some of the layers we'll talk about when we look at the tissues. The other things we can see are growth lines. Now, the first thing we have to say is notice that not all trees make growth lines. For a tree to make growth lines, it has to live in what's called a temperate climate. And a temperate climate is a climate like we have in Chicago. We have relatively cold winters where there's not much water available to the plant. And we have warmer springs and summers where there's liquid water available. Now, what we'll see later, we can't see on this, but we'll look at some micrographs, some photographs taken through the microscope, is a growth ring is really the light area and then the dark area just to the inside of it. And really, remember I said earlier, this is xylem cells. So here's what happens. During the winter, a tree doesn't make any new xylem. Why doesn't it make new xylem in most cases? Well, because remember what I said, there's not really water available. And since xylem carries water up from the roots, what's the point of making more xylem if you don't have water? So when spring comes, think about spring in this part of the world. Spring is usually a rainy season, early summer as well. So the plant starts making big xylem cells. Now, because the xylem cells are relatively big, remember what I've said, when they're mature, the xylem cells are hollow. There's nothing inside. So when you look at them, since you're kind of looking at hollow cells, they look light colored. At the end of the season, when rain starts to become less and less frequent at the end of fall, going into the early part of winter, the tree makes smaller and smaller xylem cells. So again, remember, xylem cells are dead when they're mature. There's no cytoplasm, there's no organelles. What's left? The cell wall. So when the cells are really small, the cell walls are close together and it looks darker. Now, the reason I say that we can't assume that all plants do this is if we look at plants that live in some tropical areas, or even a few non-tropical areas, where the amount of moisture is steady throughout the year, where it doesn't vary very much, those trees don't make growth rings. And there are some trees in the tropics where there are 2 wet seasons during a year, and they actually make 2 growth rings during a year. So unless you know a little bit about the type of tree and the type of climate it lives in, the number of growth trees might not be as revealing as you think it is. However, if we know the type of tree, it is very valuable, because since this is xylem and the tree makes xylem to carry water upward, notice that some of these growth rings are bigger than other growth rings. Why shouldn't they all be the same? Because if it's a wet year, the plant makes more xylem, so this growth ring is bigger. If it's a dry year, like some of these outer years, the xylem rings are smaller. Notice that these rings are made right at the inner edge of the bark. So once we look over here, the rings aren't going to get any bigger. They don't get bigger as they move towards the middle. But this means that if we find a tree trunk like this tree trunk and we look at it, okay, we can tell that there were a couple of years in here where there was a lot of moisture because our rings are pretty big. But then there were some years in here where there wasn't much moisture, where there was a drought. And so anthropologists have used this when they've been studying some ancient cultures, since a lot of human cultures, make part of their dwellings from wood, or they make corrals to keep their animals in. You can look at the wood and you can tell whether there was a lot of rain or a drought. And in some parts of the world, we've been able to tell that, when a civilization collapsed, there was sometimes a period of 20 or 30 years of drought before that civilization collapsed. Now, 20 or 30 years might not seem like that much, but keep in mind, if you're living right on the edge of having enough water for your needs, that could be enough that it destroys a small culture. So if we look at some of the cultures in the American Southwest, for instance, the Native American cultures that seem to have disappeared even before the Europeans got here, that seems to be the problem. Was there were droughts and they couldn't survive that drought. Now, when we look at conifers, notice they have an unusual type of reproduction. In some species, reproduction actually takes 2 years. So pollination occurs in year 1. And pollination just refers to the pollen landing on a female cone. Now, conifers are wind pollinated. And plants that are wind pollinated typically have to produce more pollen than plants that are pollinated by insects or some other methods we'll talk about later. So notice, this isn't a super efficient method. Why? Well, because male cones burst open, they release the pollen. Do they fertilize an egg? Well, it depends which way the wind is blowing. On a lot of conifer trees, male cones are located on the lower branches. Why? Well, wind doesn't usually blow straight upwards. It's usually blowing more sideways. So if the wind blows sideways, this reduces the chance that pollen from a plant is going to fertilize an egg on the same plant. Because remember, the whole point of sexual reproduction is genetic diversity. You still get some genetic diversity if the pollen and the egg are made by meiosis, but not as much as if they come from completely different parents. So that's an advantage. So when we look at a pollen grain lands on the female cone and it digs a pollen tube. It takes so long to dig the pollen tube. So if we look at pollen that lands on a scale this year, it doesn't dig the pollen tube completely and fertilize the egg until next year in some species. So reproduction actually takes a year. Now notice fertilization actually occurs when the nucleus of the pollen grain and the nucleus of the egg cell fuse. So this means if we look, we actually have 3 generations of plant. If we look in the very inside, we have the embryo, which is 2N. Out around that, we have a layer that's 1N. Out around that, we have a layer that's 2N again. So remember, the 2N layer is the sporophyte. So the embryo is the beginning of the new sporophyte. Out around that, we have the end of the female gametophyte. So we have a layer that's 1N. And then we have the cone, which is the previous generation sporophyte. So we have 3 generations, in a sense, within a single structure. Okay, we're about out of time, so we're going to wait to talk about flowering plants until Monday. Don't forget, no class tomorrow or Friday. I'll send you an email tomorrow morning and remind you, so check your email. And later today, I will post the animal questions, and they'll be due next Wednesday. Any questions before we leave plants temporarily? Temporarily being till next week. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. If you have any other questions, you can ask them now. Otherwise, I will see you next week and enjoy the 2 days off.